Um, what I'm going to be introducing to you is really the substance of a book which I published, which Wits Press published, written by me in the middle of last year, called Prisoners of the Past, in which I try to understand uh, why South African politics and society are where they are today. And in a nutshell, I think that the argument of the book is that there are two myths about South Africa today, which I think are mistaken. The first one, which probably doesn't get as much of an airing in the mainstream as the other one does, is the idea that what happened in 1994 was really that there was a pretend change. There wasn't a real change. White people had been in control of the country and made sure that the Constitution kept them in control of the country. There are all sorts of reasons why I think that argument is wrong, but I'm not going to deal with them unless they come up in questions, because, as I say, I don't think that in the mainstream discussion this gets that much of a hearing. The other one dominates the mainstream discussion. It's what we hear on Twitter and Facebook and in the legacy media, etc. And in a nutshell, the story is that we had this dreadful past. In 1994, we solved all the problems because we had a nice, bright, shining new constitution, and we even had a saintly president for 5 years. And everything was going splendidly. And then some rather unpleasant people came along in 2009 and messed the whole thing up. And we're living with the consequences. Now, the problem with that argument in a nutshell is that we didn't fix everything in 1994. In fact, we fixed a lot less in 1994 than we thought we'd fixed. The only thing we actually fixed in 1994 was something we had to fix if we were going to make any progress at all. And that was the fact that before 1994, 90% of our people didn't have basic rights. But what we did not fix is the fact that also meant that people were excluded from the economy's benefits, that they were very often excluded from opportunities and so forth. And also, and I don't want to bore you with the academic stuff, but the argument is based partly on an academic in America, the late Douglas North. And basically what North tells us is that you can change your political rules, but you don't necessarily change your society if that's all you change. And that's in effect what happened in South Africa in 1994. We changed the political rules, but we didn't change terribly much else. I mean, just to give you one little sense, which I often quote to people who are in the marketplace, but I think it's useful to everybody. Part of what I'm certainly not saying, as I said earlier, that nothing has changed. A lot has changed. We could go into what has changed. But the patterns remain the same as they were before 1994. So, for example, if you're interested in these issues, in the last decades before apartheid, of apartheid, when apartheid was still there, it used to be remarked repeatedly that that 90% of the wealth on the stock exchange was owned by 6 companies. Today, 80% of the wealth on the stock exchange is owned by 20 companies. Now, I guess you can say that's progress because they're 20 rather than 6, so there are more people who are benefiting and there are more people who are getting opportunities. But 20 isn't a whole lot. And the fact that they control 80% means that there isn't terribly much left over for everybody else. And that example of the stock exchange is essentially a description of what has happened in the society. Because what has happened in the society is that if you think about South Africa in 1994, as an exclusive club, a country which was run by an exclusive club, sorry. And the feature of the exclusive club is that only white people were allowed to join that club. And that was the reality before 1994. What we've been doing for these past 28 years is that the club is open to new members. So it's no longer a whites-only club. But it's still an exclusive club. And the new members don't have the same rights as the old members. And that, in a nutshell, is South Africa in 28 years. So yes, there have been changes, there have been new opportunities emerging, etc. But the majority of South Africans are still excluded from the benefits of the economy. To put it in another way, South Africa was divided before 1994 on the basis purely of race. Insiders and outsiders, and the white people were insiders and everybody else were outsiders. Today, there are still insiders and outsiders. 99.99% of the outsiders are black, but not all the insiders are white. And as I mentioned, in the insider group, there are a great deal of tensions as well, because the insider group is not particularly equal either. Remember what I said about new members and old members. Now, who is an insider and who is an outsider? My definition, which is a very simple definition, but I think it works quite well, is that if you get any income, if you get a regular income from the marketplace, say if you get a wage or a salary or dividends or a pension or whatever the case, I'm not talking about a government pension, I'm talking about a pension from one of the pension funds. If you get that kind of income, you're an insider. If you don't, you're an outsider. And roughly, obviously, these are rough figures, but I do the calculations in the book to some extent. About 1/3 of the country are insiders, if you include families and dependents and so on, and 2/3 are outsiders. Within the insider group, if you define it that way in terms of an income, remember that that means, for example, that the chief executives of all the big banks and the women who clean their offices are both insiders because they both get an income from the formal economy. But nobody would seriously argue that the women who clean the offices have the same, not only are they much poorer, but they don't have the same influence in the society or the same access to decision makers as the ladies who clean the offices have. And this is very important to understanding our politics, which is my brief. Because essentially, I would argue that if you don't understand this distinction between insiders and outsiders, and the extent to which we're still a society in which many people are excluded, then you can't really understand what is going on in our politics. And I think there are two broad ways in which we need to understand this to make sense of what appears in daily headlines. The first one is that if you look at the politics of the governing party, the African National Congress, which has preoccupied us for so many years, which may well be preoccupying us less in the future if the kind of results which we saw in the November local elections are repeated in 2024. Obviously, the ANC will be less important than it was in the past, but we don't know whether that will happen. And as we speak at the moment, despite a very poor result in last November, the ANC remains the dominant political party in this country. Bear in mind, which tends to be lost in all the headlines, etc., that the ANC had its most terrible result last November, but in fact, the ANC still has double the percentage of the vote that the Democratic Alliance has, more than double, actually. They had local elections, ANC got about 45, DA got 21, and 4 times as many as the Economic Freedom Fighters. So it remains the dominant party. And if you want to understand the factionalism within the governing party, you have to understand that it's not actually mainly I mean, personalities come into politics always, but it's not mainly about this one's fighting with that one and this one's loyal to that one, etc. It is the insider-outsider split in the society runs through the African National Congress and shapes the way in which politics are conducted in the African National Congress. And what I mean by this is if you take our current president and his supporters, President Ramaphosa and the what you could call, what people in the ANC call the CR17 faction, although I suppose it's going to be the CR22 faction this year. They are insiders. They represent insiders. And remember, and this is important for ANC politics, trade union members are insiders. They may not be equally insiders, but they're insiders in the sense that they do draw this weekly or monthly wage. And that's not a criticism, it's simply a reality. Mr. Ramaphosa himself and the people around him are themselves, well, all politicians insiders, so that gets that one out of the way. But the people who, their constituency, the people who they respond to, the people whose interests are important to them, are the insiders. The trade unions, the middle-class professionals, etc. Which doesn't mean that they don't talk a lot. Everybody in this country talks a lot about the 2/3 of the outsiders. They just don't listen to them. So there'll be lots of statements about how, poverty is terribly important and exclusion is terribly important. But the reality is that the agenda is shaped. And with respect to everybody in the room in the media, your agenda is shaped by what is of concern to inside. And Ramaphosa, and I'll come back to that in a moment, give you a couple of examples. But Ramaphosa and his group are the insiders, COSATU plus various business formations, etc., plus just very often people who happen to have access to that kind of income. Which doesn't mean, of course, that the people who vote for them are all insiders. If that was the case, they would have lost power long ago. But it means that the people whose concerns are taken seriously are the insiders. Now, the other faction, the Zuma faction or the Makhashule faction or the RET faction, whatever name you want to slap on them, sorry, are not outsiders. Because as you're going to hear in a moment, nobody in politics in South Africa is an outsider. But they see an opportunity in the fact that they are outsiders. So that group tends to often, well, always for very selfish and self-serving reasons, but that doesn't alter it, hopes to take advantage of the fact that there are many people excluded who might benefit from what we call patronage. Okay, and patronage is the idea that you take goodies and you give them to people in exchange for their political support. So the reason for all this talk of white monopoly capital, etc., remember this is all within the insider group, is not because the people who attack white monopoly capital don't really like big business. It's that they want to be part of big business. Their problem about white monopoly capital is that it isn't monopoly capital of which they're part. So they're not great heralds of the people, etc. But one of the ways in which people in this country tend to cope with being outsiders, if they have the option, because most people don't have the option, is that instead of what the textbooks would say, instead of getting a nice private sector job, because the nice private sector jobs aren't available, they go into politics. And they go into politics because it's a way of getting resources, which you can't get because the country's divided in between insiders and outsiders, and you're an outsider. So politics becomes a way of getting into the system. I often make the point that if you want to understand local government in this country, for about 80% of our people, you have to understand that the difference between being a local councillor and losing your seat is the difference between being middle class and poor. and because that seat is your ticket into the middle class. And that means you don't get up in the morning saying, what wonderful things can I do for the people who voted for me? You wake up in the morning saying, how do I stay in the middle class? And that might very often mean ignoring the people who voted for you because they don't decide who's on the ticket, on who the candidate is and who the candidate is not. So in other words, the difference between the distinction between insiders and outsiders has created an opportunity for that faction. But it doesn't mean that they themselves are outsiders, because they get a very generous return from the formal economy. Now that takes me to my next point, which I think is very often understood, which is an obvious question is, if we're a democracy and there 2/3 of the country are outsiders, who represents the outsiders? Which is the political party which speaks for the outsiders? Which are the organizations which speak for the outsiders? Well, the answer in terms of our mainstream politics is that no political party speaks for the outsiders at all. Because one of the realities of being an outsider in this country is that you get to vote, but you don't get to decide on what is important and what is not. Now, to be quite specific, just to illustrate it, I mean, there are some people who would, perhaps less so now, who would see the SACP, the South African Communist Party, as the representative of outsiders. But the SACP's fundamental base is in the trade union, in a section of the trade union movement in COSATU, which are insiders. So there's nothing outsider about the SACP. Some people believe the economic freedom fighters are outsiders. But if you look at research which was being conducted on the EFF, you discover that the average EFF member has significantly greater qualifications and higher income than the average ANC member. And that's been documented by research. So the EFF is not a party of the outsiders. It's another party of the insiders. And you could go through every single party which contests elections in this country, and you will see that they are, in fact, insider parties. And that means that we miss a whole lot in this country. There's a whole lot of South African life which doesn't get discussed in the mainstream, doesn't get reported in the media. And that is the experiences of the 2/3. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples. And this is not a media bashing section. The reason why the media don't report on these things is that the media are also insiders, and that none of the insiders really reflect on these issues. So, why, if you single out the media, you might as well single out political parties, professional organizations, everybody who participates in the South African debate, because only the insiders participate in the South African debate. And the two examples I'm going to pick, just one is simply an indication of out of touchness, and the other one is rather more of a problem of the way in which there are major aspects of South African life which don't get understood because of this insider-outsider divide. The first one is the violence that occurred last July, which caused such appalling damage in KZN. And to a far lesser extent in Gauteng. Now, the standard explanation, which sounds like a nice sort of sympathetic to the outsiders kind of argument, the standard explanation of what happened is poverty. People were driven by poverty. Now, people are certainly living in huge poverty in this country, but poverty had virtually nothing at all to do with the violence. The only sense in which poverty had anything to do with the violence is that poor people, at some point, as they do in every country in the world that I'm aware of, if there's an opportunity, if you are living in poverty or if you do have great need, to loot stores when the opportunity presents itself, because that is, which doesn't mean looting is right. It simply happens in these situations when poor people see an opportunity to increase their income because there's civil disruption. But that didn't cause the unrest. And I mean, the reason we know it didn't cause the violence is that the reason why the violence was so bad compared to previous I mean, the reason I'm stressing KZN is what happened in Gauteng really was not terribly different to what had happened previously. It was certainly no different to what had happened in 2008, just as one example, where there were what was seen as riots directed at foreigners, which were also more complicated, but that's another story. The reason KZN was so awful was that factories were burnt down, electricity pylons were blown up. It wasn't an attempt to simply take advantage of a situation. It was an attempt to disrupt in a very violent way. Now, you don't need to be a genius to know that people living in this poverty in this country don't have the means to burn down factories and blow up electricity pylons and steal ammunition from SANDF ammunition dumps, even if they wanted to. And there's no evidence that they do want to. So clearly, some very organized groups with the means to violence caused the problem. And we shouldn't have had to look too far, because published, but most of the time not noticed, we had evidence of who was responsible. Because when I say I know who was responsible, I don't say this because I have some kind of hotline to the security services or I have great sources on the ground. I'm simply trying to be aware of what knowledge we have about what's happening in our society and to apply that. And the first thing we know is that the security services in this country have been politicized for a variety of reasons, but the main reason is precisely this point that I'm making, that we haven't actually got away from the patterns of the past. Because one of the other ways in which we haven't got away from the patterns of the past is that who runs the economy and who gets the best, who gets the top directorships and the ownership of the biggest corporations, etc., hasn't changed fundamentally since 1994, despite some tinkering around the edges. And of course, there are ambitious people who would like to be part of that. And so you use your place in the security services not only to fight political battles, but to form networks, which means that you can access resources and hopefully become one of those very wealthy people with lots of economic power. So we know that is a reality. It's been, the Mafumadi Committee told us it was the reality. Various other studies of which have been published have shown us the reality. And it doesn't seem to be a stretch to suggest, well, when Jacob Zuma was arrested, that those groups would have that those people in the security cluster would begin thinking that things were not particularly going their way, and that they would have the means to do something about it. Secondly, we know also that in KwaZulu-Natal, not only in KwaZulu-Natal but elsewhere too, but particularly acutely in KwaZulu-Natal, and everything I'm saying at the moment is on the public record, is that you have networks of local councillors in KwaZulu-Natal who engage in political, who are ripping off the system, but engage in political violence. And we know this, first of all, from the fact that there have been political killings in KwaZulu-Natal, which are actually not about factional politics, which is how they sometimes portray it. They're actually, very bluntly, people who stand in the way of the networks get killed. So if you happen to be somebody who's the city manager or somebody in a key tender position or whatever, and you're not playing ball with the networks, then they may try to kill you and they may succeed. And we also know that there was a very thorough investigation, or I thought it was a fairly thorough investigation, by the Murani Commission into violence in KZN, which not only highlighted these networks, but actually told you where they got, told us where they got the address, where they got their means of violence from. And yet none of this featured in the discussion. We had, people talking about poverty and people getting arrested because that said things on Twitter, which really, you know, if you're going to blow up a public building, you don't put it on Twitter. So they're not the instigators. And you didn't really have a discussion about what we do about the fact that this failure to change, this division, has created a situation where people use networks in this particular way. The other example I wanted to point out is what the debate considers important and what it doesn't. Now, you know, at a time in which it is, you know, very fashionable, and there's nothing wrong with that, to denounce the African National Congress and the government, virtually, I mean, you know, we've been, and I count myself, you know, I make no apology that I've tried to intervene in this particular issue. Nobody is paying very much attention in the media to the fact that in KwaZulu-Natal, as it so happens, the local African National Congress, assisted by the police, is conducting a very violent war against citizens who are legitimately exercising their democratic rights. And what I'm talking about here is specifically, I mean, there are other examples. There's a shack dweller organization, Abashlali Basamjondolo, who once again, I mean, this is becoming depressingly familiar. Once again, last week, one of its senior activists in the eThekwini, Durban area was murdered. And he's the 20th Abashlali activist to be murdered. And if you speak to Abashlali and you read, and all of this is in media presentations, it's out there. Nothing, I have to say, nothing I'm saying is not in the public domain. If you look at what Abashlali are reporting, you have a situation here in which the police's response to the killing of Abashlali members in the main is to lock up the people who do the complaining for 6 months and then release them because there's no evidence against them. So you have a very dramatic story being played out in KZN, a great deal of violence, alleged misuse of the justice system, police taking sides against legitimate citizens, etc. And this is not a mainstream issue. Yeah, we've had a bit of publicity over the last week for us. It's occasionally featured in the limelight, but it's certainly not regarded as even vaguely as interesting as South Africa's vote at the United Nations, for example. And whatever you think of South Africa's vote at the United Nations, a lot more South Africans are going to be affected by the kind of things that have been happening in eThekwini that are going to be affected by which way the government chooses to vote at the United Nations. Now, I need to stress repeatedly, this is not, you know, a finger-pointing session. It is simply a description of certain realities which exist in our society. And the reason these issues are ignored or underplayed or not treated as national scandals, which they should be, is that these are things that happen to outsiders. And the EFF isn't interested in them. The SACP isn't interested in them. We haven't heard any of those organizations complain. And therefore you have a huge amount of exclusion in that particular way. Now, what does this mean for democracy? And I do want to start kind of fast forwarding because I do want to leave the opportunity for discussion. One of the questions I was asked to address in my brief was, are citizens heard in our democracy? And my answer is yes, some citizens are heard in our democracy, other citizens are not heard at all. And the problem is not the democracy. There's nothing particularly wrong with the rules. I spend an entire chapter in this book arguing against academic colleagues and others who say the problem's the Constitution, because I can't think of anything that we need to do to fix this problem that the Constitution says we're not allowed to do. It's not that democracy doesn't work. It's that if you have a society split in this particular way, then nothing very much happens for the people who are excluded. So if you look at some very concrete examples, and people who live in suburbs continually complain about government services, and that's their right, etc. I'm not saying government services are great very often, but the ability of people in suburbs to actually be heard by officials is infinitely greater than the ability of people who are not in suburbs. So that if the power goes out, or the water is cut off, or there are potholes, or the streetlights aren't working, etc., people will complain. And certainly, you can say, well, in my area they weren't fixed immediately, or whatever it's the case, and sometimes they are far too slow, etc. But they are infinitely quicker than they are in the townships. Just in very simple terms, I mean, if there's a 2 or 3 day power outage in the suburbs, people regard that as absolutely unacceptable, and they should. But 2-week outages in townships are not uncommon. If people in suburbs' water is cut off, they very legitimately complain. I've had discussions with people who've been without proper water for months, not days or weeks. So the point I'm making is that not that government serves people in the suburbs perfectly, but that if you are a suburban person, if you are an insider, your ability to get heard is very great. And there's a great irony about this over the last 20 years. Because the irony is this, that the suburbs are mainly populated, or virtually entirely populated, by people who, for one reason or another, dislike the government. The townships are populated by people who have tended historically, although they now seem to be changing their assessment, but have tended to vote for the governing party. And yet, the people who get heard are the ones who vote for the minority, and the people who get ignored are the ones who vote for the majority. And that, of course, tells us that if you are middle class, if you are able to get onto Twitter or Facebook or whatever it is, if you are able to pick up your phone and phone, whether it's your councillor or the whoever it is in the office in the municipality, you do at least get your issues placed on the agenda. And I think people living in townships and shack settlements will be able to tell you that that's not their experience, and everybody has anecdotes to back it up. Now, just share one, just to illustrate the point, which happened to somebody I know, which is that this person lives in a township. He was mugged. He went into the police station to report the mugging. The police officer was taking his statement, and halfway through taking the statement, the police officer looked at their watch and said, at 6 o'clock, it's my knockoff time, and walked off, leaving this man who'd been mugged to wait for somebody else. Now, I've never heard that happen at a suburban police station. I mean, they might be inept in all sorts of ways, but I don't think a suburban police officer would tell a suburban householder at 6 o'clock, I'm not interested in the story of how you're treated violently because I've got better things to do. So the real story of South African democracy is that it works exceptionally well for the insiders. And one of the great myths about South African democracy, which is peddled by a lot of senior academics as well, is that the Zuma years showed us that democracy didn't work terribly well in this country. And in fact, the opposite is true. The Zuma experience told us that democracy works fine in this country for the insiders, because the insiders wanted Mr. Zuma gone. And no constitution in the world, no set of political rules can stop the kind of thing that happened under Mr. Zuma. There's no corruption-proof constitution in any country in the world. What the constitution is supposed to do, and what political democracy is supposed to do, is to give you the means to do something about it when it happens. And in that sense, Jacob Zuma was brought down by media coverage, which is central to a democracy, by independent courts, which were central to a democracy, and by citizens expressing themselves, whether on the streets or in various other ways. And that is, so he was brought down by democracy. If we didn't have a democracy, he and his allies would probably still be there. The reason why he's no longer, or his faction is no longer in control of the ANC, is that in 2017, the current deputy president, Didi Mabuza, who was then head of the Mpumalanga ANC, came to the conclusion, accurately in my view, that if Cyril Ramaphosa didn't win, the ANC wouldn't get 50% in the 2019 general election. So that is another way in which democracy brought Mr. Zuma down, because the sense that voters would use their vote in order to deprive his party of a majority while he was in charge of it was the reason why Didi Mabuza felt that really the ANC, or whatever he might have felt about Ramaphosa, that the ANC needed to go for Ramaphosa because that would win them the next election. So in that sense, the system works. The sense in which the system does not work is that it is an insider system. And one aspect of this insiderness, which is what you are, I gather, going to be discussing for the next day or two, is that because of all the elements that I've been describing, there is a toxic relationship in this country between money and politics. And it isn't just the stuff you read in the corruption allegations, etc. The entire system, the entire way in which politics works in this country is that it depends on access to money, very often from people who expect a great deal in return. And that's not a surprise, because that's how insider politics works. Despite what I've said about insiders and outsiders, I still think we're a democracy. And just to, so that, I said I was giving quite a bleak view. To give a non-bleak view, in very stark terms, there are probably in the region of 5 million South Africans who are alive today who would be not alive today if we didn't have a democracy. And I'm thinking of those people who live with HIV and AIDS, because it is only because democracy gave people the opportunity, even if they are mainly excluded from the debate, it's only because democracy gave the people an opportunity to demand the medication they needed in order to survive, that they got that medication, they did survive. And as academics always do in the situation, I've written, it's actually a chapter in one of my books about precisely how that happened, etc. Now, as far as the electoral system is concerned, I mean, I know, this sounds dreadful, but I've written a paper on that one too. A few years ago, CASAC, the Council for the Support of the Constitution, asked me to do something on electoral systems, and I gather it's still on their website if you're interested in that, or it's available from CASAC. And essentially, my argument was that the electoral system was not the problem. And it's it doesn't mean that I'm saying that I don't really take sides in the paper, having looked at comparative examples and what's going on in our own country. I'm simply saying the following, that if you believe that a change in the electoral system is going to make South Africa more democratic, then you are going to be disappointed. And I think it's interesting, and I'll give you just 2 points on that. It's interesting that the kind of electoral system that most people, when you question people about what kind of electoral system they'd want, they usually come up with something very similar to what we've got at local government. And local government is very often regarded, all the data shows us that South Africans regard local government as the least effective and the least representative form of level of government in the country. So why do we assume that if the entire country operates with the system local government has, it would be better? The other point is, I mean, you make the point about how presidents are chosen and how presidents and Mabuza's role, etc. that wouldn't change if we change the electoral system. I mean, one of the proposals that's constantly on the table is, why don't we elect the president directly rather than parliament? That wouldn't change anything at all, because that process that you described would still happen in order to produce the presidential candidate of that particular party. If you want to change that sort of thing, I mean, what I do say in the paper is that I think there's some things we can change. I think that at local government level, we should introduce recall mechanisms. For those who are not familiar with it, it means that if a certain number of people petition to say we really had enough of this councillor or mayor, as the case may be, then a fresh election is held and the person has to defend their seat again. And I think we should look at primaries, because the problem you have about elites electing party candidates are fixed by primaries. They're not fixed, I believe, by changing the electoral system. And as far as the media is concerned, look, I'm really saying, I'm saying that I think that what the media does at the moment is a symptom of how the society runs. And so the challenge to the media is, can you not be a symptom of how the society runs? And that means actually going beyond this insider politics. I mean, just, to harp on the point I made, this Abashlali example that I'm mentioning is not something which would have required 34 investigative reporters. Well, it might at some point if somebody's going to seriously investigate the allegations. But at this stage in the game, all it involves is following up media releases. I mean, they're actually one of those grassroots organizations which are actually very active in their production of media releases and so forth. And I don't think, I think that people in the mainstream in the media need to look very carefully at what they can do to make themselves far more aware of the realities for the 2/3 who are not included. I think the other thing I feel quite strongly about, and it's not about this insider. Incidentally, I was a working journalist myself for 10 years. Is I realize that people go on about limited resources in the media, although I can't help pointing out that when Oscar Pistorius is on trial, suddenly the limited resources become unlimited. But even if we concede that they're limited resources, I mean, one of the problems in South African journalism, I think, is the decline of specialist journalism. When I was a working journalist, we had labor reporters and we had education reporters and we had health reporters and we had specialists. And that is important to what I'm saying, because it gives people the opportunity, if they are functioning on that, if you had the points I made about the July violence, if you had reporters specializing in these issues, they would hopefully have said immediately, but why don't you look at this? Why don't you look at that, etc. So I think there needs to be, I mean, I would make a plea for specialization, but my major point about the media is that really, I appreciate that the environment you're operating in is one in which the only voices you hear are insider voices. But recognize that they're insider voices and recognize that they're 2/3 of South Africa, which need to be heard. Incidentally, just one final point on that. I don't want to give the impression, because I may give the impression, that among the outsiders, there are no voices at all. There are actually very important voices. There are grassroots organizations. The average township is honeycombed with youth organizations and various other forms of organization. The problem is that these are just not organizations that anybody pays any attention to. So they're out there. Pay attention. It is about the economy, but I don't think that we can take the attitude, and I don't think we have to take the attitude that because it's about the economy, let's wait for somebody to sort out the economy, and we don't have to do anything about these things in the interim. We do have to do things about these things in the interim, and because you mentioned party funding and this, and of course you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the American system of government, it's actually on paper, it's a very democratic system of government. In practice, it's quite the opposite. Well, there are aspects of it that are democratic. I mean, they elect judges, they elect municipal officials and things like that. But the whole thing is so influenced by a few people with money that it doesn't matter what the rules say. So are there things we can do to change this? Yes, there are. And the example I'm going to use, for very obvious reasons, given what we're discussing, is party funding. The problems with our current funding system is that, if you're going to reduce the power of private money, you need to increase the power of public money. But the way in which we do this in the main is that there's a pot of money which is distributed among parties in relation to how they did at the last election. And that takes no account of the fact that in 5 years since the previous election, the people who voted for them might have gone off to vote for other parties or whatever the case may be. If we democratized the party funding system, we could do two things at once. We could make politics less dependent on money, and at the same time, we could, in a sense, make it very attractive for political parties to care about the majority of South Africans. And what I have in mind is this, that parties would be entitled to public funding in proportion not to the vote they received at the last election, but to the number of people willing to donate to them. Remember, it's the number of people. It's not you raise 100 million, we'll give you 100 million. And the whole point about that is, that at the moment, the parties are very interested in what rich people have to say for very obvious reasons. If you have a situation in which your public funding is going to be judged on how many donors there are, so the person on the street corner who gives you 5 rand counts for as much as the person who gives you 1 million rand, then you have a pretty good reason for taking seriously the people who give you the 5 rand, particularly if, and that would be my other proposal, you have a limit. So in other words, the person nobody can give you 1 million rand in effect. Nobody can give you, let's say, more than 5,000 rand. If we did that, I think you would have a very different situation, because suddenly, instead of Mrs. Dlamini in extension 16 being somebody who's of no interest to you, if you can persuade Mrs. Dlamini to donate $5, then suddenly Mrs. Dlamini is very important to you. And you're not going to persuade her to give you $5 unless you persuade her that actually you care about her circumstances. So, I mean, that's just a very specific way. I mean, there are others which I go into in the book I'm talking about, but we're short of time, and hopefully that concrete example gives one idea of what can be done. Okay, first of all, the insiders don't vote against their interests. The insiders have reasons for voting for who they vote for. My colleague Leila Patel at WITS and her team have done some very interesting research on this. Essentially, it's not the only factor. Right now, the main reason why outsiders vote for the governing party, or have tended to vote for the governing party, is that they believe that social grants, and that's very often not understood by insiders, social grants are by a very large distance the most important anti-poverty measure we have in this country. And it works. And people know that it works. And what Professor Patel and her team's research shows very clearly is that most people who continue to vote for the African National Congress believe that another party in government would not pay out those grants. Now, whether they're right or wrong or not is not the point. But they do want those grants retained. And I think that if you look at outsider voters over the last while or so, the last few years, you'll see that they actually make very sophisticated calculations. Because in a sense, what they're saying is, we want those grants and we're prepared to overlook a fair amount of being ignored, etc., if we don't get those grants. But there are limits. And I think that what happened in 2016 with the local elections, when the ANC lost majorities in some major metros, was that people started to say, well, actually, you've exceeded those limits. And clearly that was a very strong sentiment in the November local government elections. So what outside of voters are doing is what all voters do in this situation. I mean, we don't have time to take a poll around the room, but I mean, one of the things I've written about a long time is that there are remarkably few South Africans at the moment who believe that they really like the political party they vote for, if they vote for a political party at all. So what you're actually doing as a voter most of the time, unless you're one of the minority who's a party zealot, is that you're voting for the option which makes most sense to you in the circumstances you're in at the moment. And that's what the outsiders are doing. They're saying, given my interests and the fact that I have this vote, which I can use, how can I use it in a way which best gets out of the current situation what I need out of the current situation? So I don't think that they are irrational. See, yes, it would be far worse, because I do devote a chapter to this in the book. It's simply a myth that the Constitution has prevented change. There's nothing that anybody suggested as a possible change which the Constitution says is not allowed. And of course, what has tended to happen in many cases is that the Constitution has actually, or the way the judges have interpreted the Constitution, has actually been ahead of the politicians. When in the famous TAC case, when they said that they allowed mother-to-child transmission, the government must pay for mother-to-child transmission of antiretroviral drugs, that wasn't government policy. When they said in the Grootboom case that people must have alternative housing, that also wasn't government policy. So the courts have been more inclined to support poor people than the government, and it remains constitutional democracy can be a very useful tool in the hands of powerless people. So I don't think, I think that we would be worse off without this constitution, or without, obviously constitutions can be tinkered with. But I think what I'm describing would be worse without it. On the act itself, and it also relates to the final question about, does the fact that they have to disclose really help poor people? Look, in principle, it does help poor people, not in the sense that poor people may not have access to that information, but the point is that it does place a certain pressure to account, which may act in the interests of poor people. But does the act do that? Look, the act's a start, but I don't think it does do that. No, I mean the most obvious problem with the act is that the ceiling is far too high. 100,000 rand, and it doesn't really, it doesn't really tackle, as I would like to see it tackled, the system, the underlying problem, which I talked about. That we need very strict caps on how much any individual can get, and I think we need a system of matching finance like the one I described. What I do feel strongly about, and I'm sure this will come up in your discussions, is that we need to be very concerned about talk in the governing party at the moment about actually relaxing what we have at the moment. Because what we have at the moment may not be what we need, but it's a great deal better than what we had before. And I think that if the African National Congress goes ahead with this, it'll be a huge step backwards, and I think we need to be alert to that possibility. Yeah, you're right that politicians have incentives to be insiders, but what we need to do is change the incentives, so that if we have a more vigorous democracy in this country, then the only way they can remain insiders is by listening to the people who vote for them. and in townships and tract settlements, and they'd have to quickly change their calculations. And a lot of my work is really devoted to saying, how do we change that? I mean, my response to the question on the electoral system is to say, I think there are other ways in which we can change this. We can have, it's about more active citizenship, flows of information, and so forth. The EFF's entirely right. You don't have to be poor to represent the poor. But if you do want to represent the poor, you should at least know something about them. And that is a problem as far as the EFF is concerned. And I was simply, because we do need to close, and I need to close. So many years ago, quite a few years ago, and to me that simply sums it up. A certain, I won't mention the name, but you'll get it without trying very hard. A very prominent figure in the EFF was questioned on radio about why he had two houses. And his answer, I will never forget it, and it appears in my book. His answer was, like any young South African, when I got my first paycheck, I put down a deposit on a house. Now, the first problem about this is that if you look at every bit of evidence we have, the average young South African doesn't get a first paycheck because they're excluded from the job market. And secondly, I can assure you that those young South Africans who do get paychecks do not get paychecks big enough to buy suburban houses. So given that reality, what this gentleman who in his red overalls and beret is telling us is that he knows absolutely nothing about the people he claims to represent, and that he's as out of touch with them as the African National Congress, the DA, and all the other parties. So to me, that's just a symptom. Of course, I'm not expecting, the reality is that middle-class people have all sorts of resources and they can do these things, but they need to be in touch with the people they're speaking for. Thank you.